Hello, can everybody hear me? Should I do the Girl Scout? Go. Hello. Good. All right. Hi, I still hear a bunch of chatter, folks. We're going to go ahead and get started. I know we're a few minutes behind, but thank you all for coming. Hopefully everybody had a chance to see that fantastic QR code that's in the back of the room. That's for logging in purposes kind of thing. So we know what kind of fun activities everyone got into today, and then we have the ability to share content afterwards. So this is UX writing for non-writers, best practices and practical examples. The intention behind this is to hopefully give everyone some tips and tools, and then also bring some familiarity with work that you're already doing and ways that this connects to the bigger sphere of everything else that we do at Enterprise Technology. Specifically, the theme of some of the interactions we've had today are professional development. So in that vein, we look forward to hopefully delivering some great content for you in that space. So our agenda for today, this is a bit of an homage to a journey map. So we're looking at what it is and moving through the evolution of consideration, engagement, practice, and connection. How do we really connect with what it is, and how do we use it? And what are some different ways that interacts with the things that we do? And then how can we continue the conversation today and beyond? My name, if you haven't guessed it, is Tara Haverkamp. I've had the pleasure of being at UTO for several years at this point, and ASU even longer. So for those of you that I know, welcome. And for those of you I don't know, welcome. Nice to see everybody and in person today. I work at Enterprise Technology, you guessed it. I am a content and knowledge strategist, and I also have dual appointment as a technical communication user experience faculty associate for the College of Integrated Sciences and Arts, CISA. And in these roles, I get to support lots of really neat things centered around writing and content strategy, technical training, adult education. Some of the courses that I teach include fundamentals in technical communication, intellectual property and copyright law, that's a fun one, and user experience, where we look at UX process. So what is that process evolution like? If anybody's heard of things like design thinking, that has some mirrored methodology in both. And then when we hear the UX, there's definitely a lot of terms and connections there. So it'll be fun to kind of dig into that a bit more too. I also have some research publication on an international independent research study that I did involving localization in the US and Canada, looking at contexting and the way different groups communicate, even global English, how different areas anticipate and expect and want their information so that they can consume it and understand it and use it effectively. I would also like to welcome a special guest that we have, Mr. Quinn Richardson. If you'd like to stand up, I'll go ahead and give you a minute to talk as well. So Quinn has the fun job, I think, of being our UX writer assistant. He's a student worker in the technical communication program. He's also an intern, comes to us with a background from the Marine Corps with technical publications, and then also international English education. So we're really delighted to have Quinn with us and on the team. And I think that he fully represents a great example of why we should have more students and integrated opportunities. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and let Quinn talk a little bit about how he connects to the work that we do.
Microphone. Hello, everybody. Thanks again for coming out today for selecting our panel. I think we have a lot of fun things on board today. I think Tara pretty much hit on the nose. I don't think I'm super interesting. In fact, I think a lot of times I feel like Tara's lost puppy because I'm always just asking questions all the time. But I do have a really deep passion for technical, technical communications, writing in general. Before this, like Tara mentioned, I was in the Marine Corps. I was succinctly. Publication manager for the squadron. I was in charge of all the technical data that the aircrafts would use. And that kind of sparked the interest that I had with technical communication as a field. And then before that, I spent a few years in Europe teaching English and working on some language learning programs. I've been part of the team working with Tara since March, I believe. We've done a lot of really fun work. We've done some training overhauls. We've done a lot of work with content mapping and journey mapping, and just trying to do our best to engage with a few different teams to disseminate some best practices for UX writing. And I hope that we can kind of touch on some of those bases today. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me and pull me aside, and I'll be happy to support.
Thank you. Thank you, Quinn. To kind of connect that a little bit more, I appreciate your connecting with our work there. To address some of these finer additional elements down at the bottom, some of the work that we've been doing involves captioning. So if anybody's ever gotten a training where you hire a third-party vendor and they come in and they deliver a training for us, how do we mobilize that, get that to be more accessible for our users? How do we integrate captions? What are best practices with captions when we're talking about different language users, different abilities, and make sure that that content is as effective and purposeful as we need it to be. So thank you, Quinn, for your work in that space as well. A bit about UX writing. So what is it? We're going to cover things about the topic in general, about how professional writing and editing and content strategy come together. We're going to try and focus on samples and exercises. This is really a big topic. So I think one of the biggest challenges is trying to figure out what we can include in this amount of time. Obviously, these are courses and topics that I teach, but there are a lot of opportunities for us to integrate this with our work and try to come up with functional ways that we can help mobilize and support the folks that are doing the work. If you've got somebody on your team that writes KB articles or works on proposals or cost estimates, or if a person writes an email, there are lots of ways where we want to improve our writing and the ways that we're going about the things that we do on a communication scale. So UX writing as a definition has to do with using words, creating words in user experiences. So if you were to imagine 10, 15 years ago, a most common example might be something static. Maybe it's a newspaper, maybe it's a one-page FAQ. That would be an example of a static communication. It's not moving, it's one way. When we're talking about UX and we're talking about creating words in user experiences, we're looking at user interfaces, ways that we're engaging, using digital assets, websites, ways that we're navigating and clicking on things and moving through an experience. Those are the words that we're talking about for specific, the definition for UX writing. There are some fun quotes that I've sprinkled in here talking about how important user experience writing is and how we want to connect with our audience. If you ever go to a website and maybe it's one of those clickable things and you think it's neat, but then you get there and it's a brand you've never heard of and it's a poor experience and you're like, well, golly, I'm just never going to go back there. I don't trust them. I'm not going to use that. That's the connection that we're talking about. We want to make sure that we're building things in a thoughtful and intentional way, using an agile approach with iteration and looking at how we can support our users and connect with them. So that way they want to work with us. That way they want to connect with us. User experience writing is connecting users, but it's also connecting content and context and scannable copy. This is a fun quote from medium.com where it says no one reads. Website sample looks pretty simple. It's a medical company, family practice. Medical, we see a lot in technical writing because you're dealing with something that's technical and oftentimes and then related to a user. So it's a different audience versus connection point. So the same website had a bunch of content in it that maybe you didn't see the first time. This example highlights reading patterns, right? So when you went into that website, you probably didn't think anything of it. Readers are focused in an F pattern. It's scannable copy. So when I looked at that website the first time, I didn't see this embedded text. It says that they're accepting presents. It's bring your firstborn child and a stack of rubies. And they're open Monday through Friday at the witching hour. Obviously, this isn't copy that we would want to promote, but it is impactful in showing us just how much we do and don't see. So looking at this in the context of what we just saw, user experience writing, when we're looking at the journey, we want to support the user before they click. They want to know what they're clicking on, what they're going to go to, and what that experience is going to be like. When they're in the experience, I've got, it's a bit of an askew pattern. And the reason is that if you ever get into an interface and then somewhere you get stuck along the way, there are some different routes. Maybe you need to mitigate. Maybe you've got a question. You know, if you're duo authenticating and you don't have a token, maybe you need to go a mitigation route. Or if you have another question, maybe you need a different kind of support. So it's supporting the user before, during, and after the evolution of their process. So if you were to think of a process or something that you're designing where somebody comes in and then they exit, this is that process that we're looking at. This is fun by one of our collaborators that we work with often. Frictionless UX design could potentially raise customer conversion rates up to 400%. Every dollar spent on UX brings between $2 and $100 in return. So if we were to look at that in an ASU context, you're talking about students. You're talking about whether students decide to go ahead and submit the RFI, or whether they want to engage and in what ways. UX writing is connected to other forms of, very fun. UX writing is connected to business and professional communication, right? So one of the things that we run into is nomenclature. How is UX writing different than technical writing? How is it different than business writing? There are a lot of connected areas. So looking at UX writing and professional copy, this is definitely one of the challenges that we have in this space, is having folks be aware of the work that it is that we're doing and feel connected to it. I don't know how many of you have seen a call to action for something technical writing or technical communication. I've been in the field for many years at this point. I could probably ask my family members and they would not know what it is. UX writing has this great way of integrating some of these fantastic concepts that have been integrated into the field, and then also bringing it into the future to focus on the UI component. So looking at business communication, if we were wanting to try and make this practical, as far as a practical example. So business writing versus UX writing in this space, if you had an somebody that was supporting a new hire orientation process, the HR representative that would be welcoming them and introducing them to the rest of the department, they would be still talking in a formal tone. They would still be communicating according to practices and strategies that would be affiliated with business, and it would be very much business writing. Not a UX writing practice, right? So that would be a difference. Now they would be connected in other ways. So they are interconnected, but they're not interchangeable. UX writing, as I mentioned, is the UI UX focus that we talk about: purposeful, clear, and concise writing. Technical writing is actually one of the foundations of UX writing. So technical writing and UX writing have some significant connections on the functionality of writing. Now, for anybody who's been in industry in IT for anything more than 10 years or better, when it comes to technical writing and communication practices, we used to be talking in a passive voice. It used to be lots of content. So I would come in and work with teams and they would, nobody wants to write in long form. Does anybody want to read in long form? Yeah, so that's the challenge, right? We want to write what's going to be used. And if it's not used, we want to refine it so that it can be used. We want to make sure that the copy that we are creating is functional and purposeful and useful. Got medical and emergency communication on here. So if we're talking about things like COVID communication, or if we've got some kind of a medical emergency that we've got to communicate, It would also be alike. There would certainly be some overlap in the communication process and the fundamentals as far as the types of the way that we want to write according to formality and tone. Some of the differences that you would see, I've got marketing copywriting on here. So one of the things that we would see different in that process would be where somebody's going out and they're trying to engage you to get you to participate in something for a particular reason. So that nuanced difference with UX writing would be more along the lines of, you're a current student and we're going to go ahead and launch Duo. So you're going to need to know how you don't lose credentials in 6 months. So we've got a process that you need to be involved in, and you very much want to. We just have to figure out how to get that touch point to you in a successful way. And then also be mindful of how to not give too much content. So that way it becomes part of the mindless or excessive content burden that we're already dealing with. Why does it matter? When we identify and understand user behavior, we can develop better and more effective experiences. If you think about a time that you used an interface, you went in and you clicked on something and it was something that you needed to do. It was very much a UX writing example. And you get there and you get stuck, or the verbiage is really confusing. And you're just like, what am I supposed to do here? You ever get to a site and you're just like, I need more information. Where is the more information button? Better yet, I don't like your information. How do I give you some feedback to tell you about it? These are things that we, on the scale of communications, we really need to look at, because we always think about research as in an opportunity up front. Okay, well, but let's talk about the reverse side of that and say, what about maintenance? How do we make sure that we create a process that includes KPIs and feedback? Because those are users that have gone through our process and they have the ability to give us information that would support our process evolution and better communication design. So in the bad example, and even the good one, if it's good, you don't think about it. If it's bad, it stays with you. It's kind of like any kind of negative experience that has some emotion connected to it. You tend to recall it better. So the importance here is that there are things that we can learn from good experiences and bad experiences. So if you're going through an ASU process and you have a terrible experience, we can learn a lot from that. And if you have a good experience, we can learn a lot from that too. Talking about writing in motion, how does this connect specifically to enterprise technology process? So if we're looking at the design process, if anybody's gone through design at work, if we look at the process evolution, if we support communication in the beginning, content clarity in the beginning, we more effectively move through that process. We can also look at archival, right? Is there anybody that doesn't think that we have too much content in some places? No? I know I said that a bit askew. We have a lot of content, and we have a lot of content in a lot of places. One of the things we struggle with is leveraging bots when we have too much content or the wrong content that exists. It makes our ability to support our user less effective. So there are some pretty heavy hitting things that we need to leverage and work together to combine and refine content. So I'm suggesting that UX writing supports the design process, archival and transitional communication process, looking at how we can leverage our communication. So if you've ever designed or worked with somebody working on copy and then tried to put it in 4 places, it can be a process challenge. There are some really good ways that we can move about that. Journey mapping is something that we've also done. And this is a fun one that integrates user experience and design technology, or excuse me, design thinking when you're looking at a process. So how do we leverage content in a way that helps our stakeholders and our teams be more efficient in process? We'll get into that. So here's another iteration on the former. So UX writing and UX design, project planning, ways to integrate into the planning process and the project development process, transitioning content, whether it's moving from one software to another software, or if it's moving archived or older materials into a new space. One of the examples I like to think of You've got a house, and if you go to replace your floors, you're probably going to clean. If you don't, you might, what would that look like? Throw your things outside in a trash bag. But then once your floors are replaced, you're not going to bring the trash bags back in. You're going to clean it, right? So the same kind of thing when we're talking about content. We want to look at how we can preserve what we have in a way that we can store it and save it, but then also make it new and fresh when we move it forward. Access. When we're talking about creating communication, it's not created equal. We need to make sure that we're communicating for the folks that desire the communication in the most effective way. And then leveraging feedback, interaction, and KPIs, as I mentioned. So UX writing, to help kind of iterate, and hopefully some of this might sink in. We're talking about defining content early. So if you've ever gone through a work process, a process, and you go all the way through the design process and then you're editing the content. If you defined what the content purpose was and the content was early, then you can design what it is that comes after with a clear purpose. So oftentimes we get so busy because we've got a sequence or a flow or a place that we intend to start because we've got a team that needs to work on some action items. We have the ability to get in clarity at certain stages that can really impact our ability to move through project process. It also gives us the ability to interact with stakeholders. So as we define what that content is, think about the agile and iterative approach. So if we've got something that then we can put this into a low fidelity wireframe and then we can send it back to stakeholders in a way that's succinct, concise, connected, and then they can provide feedback, that gives us the ability to have that refinement early. If anybody's gone through countless edits or then reiterations or challenges at different parts in the process, you can imagine what kind of efficacy that would build in by having that clarity early. A lot of this, I'm going to just give a little bit of a disclaimer. Some things are very generalized in order to fit in this time. If there are questions about refining and defining some of the content, feel free to reach out to me. There will also be shareable resources at the end. So this is not all I would ever say about a writing process, but the idea about pre-planning and then defining purpose and then refining in this sequence, going through journey mapping and UX writing, some of the biggest challenges that I see have to deal with where we get started and where we end. So if somebody ever came to you and said, hey, I need you to write this thing. If you have the ability to do pre-planning before you started writing, it's, I'm sure everybody at some point has been in an English or a writing class where they talk about brainstorming. So any ability that you have to refine your content before you create it or before you share it, the better it's going to be. So pre-planning content, defining purpose, refining the content, iterating and designing, and then supporting feedback. So when I'm looking at this, I'm looking at this being project integrated and phase 4 being project integrated. So the first one, yes, you might integrate with some of the folks on the team, but really having a refined focus as to where we're going before we get there, before we get started. So this might be, focusing on content strategy with a smaller team before launching to a larger team. UX writing and journey mapping. I want to give a couple of samples here. I did not purposefully, I did not include a UTO example or ET example. I didn't want us to get too stuck on the practicality and the exact connection into the pieces. But what I want to show you is that this is a sample of a journey map. It's not the only way a journey map can look. They can be exponentially more complicated. They can be less complicated. But some of the things that are very meaningful in this interaction is that you're moving through the phases, right? So if I said earlier that 2 of the biggest challenges I see are getting connected and then leaving the process. So we can design these fantastic processes. So think about new ASU online resources that are developed after a student has already been, started into a program. Unless they have a purpose to go back to that website or a touch point, they're not going back. If you just completed a fantastic training and 2 months later they came out with a new one, well, unless somebody tells you about it, you're not just accessing that resource. So looking at where you get started, how do you get into the awareness? And then what is it like when you go and you check out the website and you decide whether or not it's something that you want to engage with? And then acquisition, most commonly I see that more like engagement. So I'm gonna go back to that Duo example. Once they need to go ahead and activate their two-factor authentication, they would start the engagement phase. Once they're there, there would be also there would be additional steps, right? So whether or not they needed to get a token or whether or not they need to go ahead and set up the pop-up on their phone or download the Duo app. And then loyalty, think about that like your feedback, your maintenance, your mechanism for how you're going to continue to drive. If you get to that site and you're like, I want more, or if you get to that resource and you're like, I need to know who is the point of contact. So think about that as follow-up. The other thing that's really meaningful here is we're talking about phase 1 through phase 4. These experiences get to be so layered. And that what we look at when we design these is challenges. We can learn a lot from the folks that go from point A to B to C. But if there's somebody that's going to get stuck midway through the process, we need to mitigate that obstacle before we start. So I've seen these journey maps be developed and be successful in project mapping. So imagine a complex project, 2 teams don't necessarily agree, 2 technical teams coming together, and there's a difference in opinion as to what the most important part is or what the timeline is. So then if we do a deep dive and we sit down and we go through questions and answers and get to the meat of those phases within the journey map, we can then create an illustration that has key points highlighted and mitigation steps. So then we can look at how many touch points we need and what obstacles we need to pay attention to. On the Duo project, what was impactful in this particular exercise was identifying that depending on the timeline that we launched, we could lock out students or potentially lock out faculty, and we could impact their grades in a way they could fail. So this tool, again, not this one, this is a sample, was able to help the team then go back to stakeholders and integrate different project teams so that way everybody could level set. So these are some great examples for how we can integrate UX writing in some of the processes that we do. UX writing is clear. So I've given you some examples as to how it integrates at enterprise technology, but then I'd also like to give you some resources as far as how you can implement strategy. So let's say you're a UX writer tomorrow. You want to figure out how you can integrate some of the practical work into the work that you're doing. Has anybody ever started a writing assignment and they didn't know who it was for? At work, has somebody ever said, hey, write this thing, and you weren't sure why? Maybe you've been the person who's getting the assignment and you are like, I don't understand the why, but I don't want to ask the question. It's really important. I was asked to write an SOP. I'm like, great, okay, what's our purpose? We weren't very clear. We actually had to go through multiple folks to figure out why we were doing it. And it wasn't to be argumentative by any means, but to understand. When we determined that our audience was leadership, we went from a different communication design. It wasn't going to be a 1-2 process chart. We weren't going to have a list form. It wasn't going to be a short FAQ. It was going to be an abstract that started with explanations about what the document was going to be about. At one point, I think we were writing 10 pages. It's like, nobody's going to read this. Why are we writing this thing? Nobody's going to read it. Are you going to read it? Who's going to maintain it? Okay. But when we can reset and we can iterate before that launches, it ends up being so helpful. So who's the audience? You examine the audience, the language, the experience, and commitments. So if it's leadership and they've got 5 minutes to look at it, you need to keep that in mind. If it's a particular audience or group, maybe it's somebody at a community college. Well, then we're going to frame our terminology based on that. You're also going to think about the level of commitment they're going to have with the document. How much do they really want to read it? Are they just reading it because they're proofing it? Okay, well then who's going to actually use it? So it is cautious to be, when you're looking at the process and you're trying to figure out who your audience is, if somebody tries to tell you it's an editor or somebody who's just reading it to refine it, that's not your intended audience. Okay, so you want to ask what the purpose is, whether they're looking for answers, because what are they going to get out of it? How should it be presented? Depending on what their need is, it might be different. It might not be a website. It might be a Slack message. It might be something else. You want to think about organization, format, and length. Oftentimes, I get asked to do format and organization before we know content. If we don't know the content, how do we design the format? This is organization and process flow. Think about why you're writing it, how you're going to measure success. What are the KPIs? I once revised 100 website pages and there were 0 KPIs and the content was 5 years old. There were no strategies in place for maintenance. Okay, I know we're after lunch, I'm so sorry. Measure, so you want to measure before and after you make a change, if you can. I'm going to go ahead and take off my jacket. Give everybody just a second. Does anybody need to stretch? Because it looks like you've got some yellow in the document. Food coma. I promise you that we'll get through a few of these. I plan to reiterate this and then share this back out so that you have some of this to take. And then we'll do some activities. So we're almost there. All right, so research, surveys, and feedback. If we're on a project and we don't have the ability to go and do a 100-person survey before we get started, there are opportunities. There are other things that we can look at. We can put ourselves in the user perspective. Are users able to complete a task? Maybe I go through and I design something so a user can define it, can complete a task. I can go and ask my neighbor or my partner or somebody else that's a colleague to go through and find out if they can functionally use it, right? So there's a difference in levels of reading. We looked at that F pattern. That's going to be your scannable first glance. When you actually need to use the website, you're going to go back and read it. So we want to make sure that somebody can look at it at first glance, that they can go back and read it. And then 5 minutes later, they know what they've read. Like there's an engagement component. So if you ever had to read some emergency communication, maybe it was COVID, and there was an action item where you needed to know what to do, we want to make sure that that content is purposeful enough to where they're going to retain it. Are we solving problems? Is it clear? We want to iteratively improve. So if we have the ability, like I said, the low fidelity set of wireframes, get it out there, reiterate. Use your own words. So somebody sends you some copy, maybe they send you a website and they're like, hey, will you read this and tell me what you think? Take the copy and write it in your own words. Try to re-summarize, try to restate what you think it says, because that's one of the levels of determining if it's effective. If we can reiterate what we think it means, then that can help us reorganize the content. Maybe we see something askew when we're iterating or when we're working on a refining opportunity. Some other tips that you want to do is you want to remove excess formatting. I often get copy and samples that have 5 different font types on one page or images that are distracting. Depending on what the purpose of your content is, removing some of that formatting helps the content be clear. And also plan maintenance and feedback. That's one way to stay current. And I see that as being one of those, one of the low-hanging fruits per se, because we don't often have the opportunity or have it built in to go through and look at what are we going to do with this content in 6 months. This is important. 85% of users read high school level or below. Even users who read at a higher level don't always want to read at a higher level. We have so much content that we consume. This really speaks to the level of writing and the way that we need to make sure that our content is consumable. So when you're looking at content organization, this is again tying back to those tips. What can you take and what can you use when you're working on a KB article or a proposal or an email or even a Slack copy or the next iteration of a conference proposal that you're working on? You want to use plain language, avoid jargon, use polls when you can. Organize the content into what's most important. And if you've ever written something and you're not really sure how great it is, or you've just done a free write, you're working on a brainstorm, pull it back into an outline. Say, what am I getting at here? One of my favorite things is to ask, so what? I just wrote a 5-page paper, so what? What am I getting at? What is the most important thing here? Because sometimes you'll find that just a slight reorganization, or maybe you've got content chunked in one section and it's gapped in another. So reorganizing and refocusing, like what you're getting at, it's helpful. Plan for that F pattern. Try to make sure that your most important information is first and to the left. If you've not on here, if you have the opportunity, don't have left alignment, right alignment, and center alignment on the same page. Anything you can do to really help a user get from the beginning of the content through it is going to help you and your user. Focus on concise and most effective language and terms. There are connotations to a lot of everything that you use can elicit a different image or a different perception for a user. So it's really important to think about the words and the language that we're using. Plan for primary, secondary, and tertiary audiences. So even if you're not designing for somebody who needs the technical, maybe you're working on some copy and you're like, oh, everybody knows all of these acronyms. I'm not going to explain them. A best practice would be to make sure that your content is complete. So if you're doing a one-pager, try to have the terminology defined. And you can do a lot of things, but you need to make sure you're consistent with yourself. UX writing takes a village. So everybody in here does writing at some point in time in their day, in their job, and in their life, whether it be text or any other kind of copy. And we can support each other. We can connect to talk about more tips. Maybe you know of a particular section in your area that you're working on that needs some assets or resources. Maybe we can come together and see what kind of tips and tools we can focus on for them. Maybe you've got some projects that you work on once or twice a month. Maybe you're working on maintenance or archive. And we can have some conversations about how best to support your process. We can set up coaching sessions. And look at developing skills on your team. So the thing about UX writing and technical writing, we don't have that many folks with those particular titles in the department, but we have lots of folks that work in those spaces. So figuring out ways to connect those particular users with tools and resources. And if you see something and you're like, gosh, it just seems like it could be better, you're probably right. So it doesn't hurt anything. And I'm just a Slack away. When we are finished with the session, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that everyone has access to some supporting resources about the mini strategy that we went through, those tips and tools. The PowerPoint is great for the PowerPoint, but that's not the most digestible way for accessing those tips. So I do also have those in a Google, in a doc form. We'll also jump into some session exercises on concise writing and global English. So we'll have a chance to work on writing as groups here in just a moment. I also wanted to make sure that everyone had access to the tips and tools. Think about that more option on what it is that we're trying to unpack here. So everything from, there's a UX writing style guide. There's a link to one of my publications. And then there's also some additional resources that just connect to technical communication, technical writing, UX writing, but in a general space. So if we're looking at something that you need for your team, that would be something to connect on. But also wanted to make sure that there are some resources and connection points. So without further ado, we have a couple of amazing helpers, and we're going to go through each table, and we've got a Slack channel, and then we have some document links where we go over the exercises. And basically we're going to take questions in groups of threes. The questions, we're going to take them by like 1 or 2 or 3, and then have each group just kind of fill in the response on a Google Doc, and it's all connected in Slack. So this is going to complete the presentation section. We're going to move into exercises, and then we'll come back for some questions if there are any. And I think we've got 3 different folks, and then I'll be walking around too. So we'll help everybody kind of work through the exercises. Go ahead, if you have your cellular device or computer, go to the Slack channel, which is UX writing-strategy for those exercises.